The Warhammer 40k IP has always been something that has been unbelievably fascinating to me. There's just so much of it, and almost no one I know of in my day-to-day knows of its existence. It's incredibly paradoxical. The average person will have no idea what the fuck you're talking about if you ask them if they've ever heard of Warhammer before. But if you ask any gamer or person that considers themselves a nerd even a little bit, you'll probably get an answer in the affirmative. Back in 2011, when Space Marine 1 came out, I knew the name Warhammer for the tabletop game, even though I've never played it, but not in the realm of video games. I bought it, and even though some might say that it was a poor man's Gears of War, I didn't really care. I loved every second of it. It was just cool. I don't know how else to describe it. From the absolute badass armor of the Ultramarines to the zealous dogma of the Imperium of Man. I didn't know it at the time, but this is really where my aforementioned fascination with the Warhammer 40k universe began. So when Space Marine 2 was announced back in December, and it was also being developed by Saber Interactive, who previously worked on World War Z, not only was I in awe that a 13-year-old game was getting another entry in the series at all, but it was also set to be a direct sequel to the first game's story. Just think about that for a sec. Space Marine 2 is a direct sequel to a game that is 13 years old that no one really talks about anymore, albeit for its cult following today. Now in this video, I want to outline a few things that I think the game needs to be successful on launch. These lists that I like to make are never really in any particular order, just a collection of thoughts that I just want to get out. So Space Marine 1's atmosphere is definitely not what I think about when I picture a Warhammer 40k game. The game's main antagonists were primarily the orcs, who were just essentially space morons who make all their broken looking ships and weapons work by virtue of believing that they'll function as they think that they should. It's actually the lore accurate reason behind why all their shit works. You should look it up, it's kind of funny. Apparently this is why it's so much fun to play as the orcs in the tabletops also. A lot of them charged at you with their massive dumb looking underbites, cursing and dying in equally comical ways. None of them looked intimidating, and I never once had the thought of, oh fuck, here we go, when I met any one of them on the battlefield. Now maybe I'm being a bit harsh on a 13-year-old game that, to my recollection, never really blew anybody away critically except for maybe the hardcore fans of the 40k genre, and maybe the devs never had enough budget to do everything that they wanted. Everything always felt a little lighthearted for the 40k universe. The good news here is that everything that I've seen from Saber Interactive relating to Space Marine 2 looks absolutely banging when it comes to this category. The atmosphere of Space Marine 2 looks perfect for a 40k game. Everything is huge and imposing. The sense of scale for you as a Space Marine is perfect. Even when you walk by guardsmen, some of them will just take a knee and give you the respect and reverence that you deserve for merely being one of his angels. But apart from all of this, the planet that's shown in all the trailers, planet Avrex, looks just utterly war-torn, and it's great. Buildings are reduced to rubble, there are piles of bodies pushed off to the corners of the street and on the sidewalks, and as if all that wasn't enough, the massive hordes of enemy Tyranids in the background and flocks of flying enemies hundreds of feet away. The war effort against the Tyranids has clearly taken its toll, and it all looks perfect. If you ask any Warhammer fan what their favorite part of the universe is, the most common answer you'll get back by far will be the lore and the storytelling of Warhammer. The well that is the lore to this universe is almost unending, and it is for that reason that the second item on my list is the story of Space Marine 2. Although Space Marine 1 felt like a knockoff Gears to some back in 2011, I do think that the story was serviceable for what it set out to do. And all this time later, I think it paid off because Space Marine 2 is a direct canonical sequel to the first one. Just to summarize real quickly what happened in the first game in a few short sentences if you're unaware, you play as Captain Titus. Titus leads a squad of Ultramarines who are genetically engineered super soldiers and the finest weapons that the Imperium of Man can muster. You're tasked with going to a planet called Forge World Graia, which is responsible for producing weapons and equipment for the Imperium. Graia has been overrun by the orcs. Your mission is to remove them from the planet. All of them. Permanently. You're accompanied by two of your squad mates, Sidonis, the grizzled veteran and second in command to Titus, and the absolute by-the-book bitch, Leandros. So I say this because in Titus's efforts to contain the inevitable breach and spread of the forces of chaos, like the bro that he is, he must touch a source of chaos. Leandros finds this out and rats on him to the Inquisition. I could explain who the Inquisition are, but it'll take like another 10 minutes of an aside, so just Google it if you really want to know, or you just use context clues. So the story of the whole game takes place, and the Inquisition shows up at the end of the game and puts Titus in a fancy new pair of Ultra bracelets. Those are essentially the broad strokes of the game story. Now, I did like the story at the end of the day because it's not like the Ultramarines just show up to Gry and absolutely fuck shit up and pack it up and go back to Ultra home base. Because of the circumstances of the events of the story, the main character is basically arrested and taken to Ultra jail, and we never really know what happens to him after that. We do know, based on the trailers, that approximately 200 years have passed between the events of Space Marine 1 and 2, and that Titus was knocked down to the rank of lieutenant from captain. We know this because when we get a look at Titus's face in the trailers, he has 2 other service studs in his forehead, each of which represents 100 years. The devs have also confirmed that he was demoted after the events of the first game. I think at one point in time a sequel was planned, but that never really panned out. And I think that Space Marine 2 needs to have a good story, because not only is that essentially the backbone of any story-driven game, which this is, but this game is a labor of love to some extent. Someone at Saber with decision-making power obviously loves Warhammer and Space Marine enough to give it a direct sequel. Furthermore, Warhammer is an IP that is really all about its lore, and the fans know that, so I think it'd be a total slap in the face if the story was shitty. So moving on to number 3 in the list, I want to talk about the replayability and different game modes that Space Marine 2 could bring to the table. In the first game, you had the standard single-player campaign, and much to its credit, it also had a hero shooter-like PvP multiplayer mode that consisted of 2 teams of 4 facing off against each other. There was also a mode called Exterminatus that was essentially a horde mode. Back in 2011, I don't think that it was any more than it needed to be. But since the campaign also happens to be full 3-player co-op, which is an excellent touch by the way, I think it'd be a really nice touch if there was a sort of competitive co-op arcade mode to the campaign like you see in Strike Scoring in Destiny or in Halo Campaign arcade mode, where you and your friends can compete for the most kills or highest score for that given level and earn different accolades along the way. It would also definitely be cool if they included a PvP side to the game in Space Marine 2, although depending on how the overall combat system works, I could probably take it or leave it. I do, however, think it'd be a cardinal sin if there was no horde mode style survival game type. I'm a little biased here as I'm just a sucker for these types of game modes in any game, really, that I enjoy, but Space Marine 2 is just begging for it, especially based off of all the footage that we've been shown already with the massive hordes of Tyranids that you're cutting down with heavy bolters left and right. And adding on to that point, if Exterminatus does make a return, give us equipment and fortifications to build and upgrade as the game progresses. I would love to see things like automatic turrets, rocket turrets, freeze towers, and different abilities that can aid you as you get further and further into the waves. In this instance, I think that Gears of War's Horde mode is the perfect example and inspiration to follow. If nothing else though, if Exterminatus mode makes a return, have it fleshed out more than it was in Space Marine 1, and I'll be happy with that. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, the Warhammer universe has an almost never-ending amount of lore, and there is seriously a nauseating amount of detail in any given piece of that lore. And it's because of this that I think that Space Marine 2 really should have a healthy dose of variety in it. In Space Marine 1, you had orcs which really only came in one flavor, or at least that's how it felt like to me, and you had the Chaos faction, which essentially boiled down to Chaos Space Marines. They were bigger and tougher than your run-of-the-mill fodder enemies and didn't just run straight at you, they actually shot back with some semblance of accuracy. The Tyranids are an entire hive species that have 57 different creatures in the race, and that isn't counting what are considered war machines and bio-titan sized creatures. There is more than enough inspiration to pull from when it comes to enemy types, which should serve to spice up the gameplay plenty. Warhammer Darktide is actually a perfect example of this. In that game, you have trappers, flamers, shock troopers, mutants, ragers, dogs, regular poxwalkers, and the list goes on. But this all serves the gameplay brilliantly, as you can't really stay in one spot for longer than a few seconds on the higher difficulties. Otherwise, you'll just go down immediately and end up becoming an anchor for your team. Space Marine 2 can and should embrace this philosophy when it comes to its enemy design to keep things fresh and challenging, especially in the higher difficulties and in co-op. All that being said, I am fairly certain that at least one trailer trailer already alluded to the existence of a chaos faction of enemies. At least I think that's what they were. So we'll see. Between the Tyranids and the forces of chaos, there really should be no shortage of enemies that they can throw at us. Between the enemy types, weapons, and what I think might be the most important part, your power armor. I would love to have nothing more than to earn different cosmetic armor as I complete tasks like how Darktide handles that with their penance system. You fulfill a certain requirement and you get rewarded with a corresponding type of cosmetic. It could be an item for your helmet slot, chest, legs, or back. I know I'm drawing a lot of parallels to Darktide for this, but for all that game fumbles on, it definitely nailed its variety in some aspects. Now, I'm not saying that it has to be done exactly like that, but go back and look at some of the art for Warhammer and you'll realize it's absolutely fucking awesome. And I want to dress up my walking refrigerator of a Space Marine how I want. Now, will that happen? I have no idea, but in keeping with the spirit of variety and how vast the Warhammer universe is, I think it should. So I saved this for the last item of the list because it is arguably the most important. We live in an age of gaming where there's a sea of buggy, incomplete products that get shoved out the door knowingly for a quick buck. It's sad, shameful, and frankly unacceptable in most cases. Yet here we are. Based on the trailers for the game so far, it looks absolutely gorgeous. The graphics and overall presentation of the game looks stunning. The massive hordes of enemies crashing against the wall trying to get into the well-fortified battlement, the several huge flocks of winged Tyranids that are hovering in the city waiting to nosedive down and tear a platoon of guardsmen to shreds. It all looks great, and I want to do my part for the God Emperor, but that's marketing and I want that to be how the game actually looks and runs and feels on launch day. Nothing will suck more than booting up this game for the first time, ready to step knee deep in Xenos, and there's a massive performance issue just waiting for me. Now, the one thing I will say is that I actually have faith in this area, and the reason why is because Saber Interactive, the dev studio building this game, is also responsible for making World War Z. I think I mentioned that a little bit earlier. The engine, the Swarm engine, as it's aptly named, renders hundreds of fast-moving zombies on screen at any given moment with little to no issue. Space Marine 2 also happens to be running off of a heavily modded version of the Swarm engine as well. I've put about 35 hours into World War Z on PC with some friends, and I'm happy to say that there were hardly any performance issues while playing that game. I think this is all a very good sign since Saber's track record with World War Z is pretty good when it comes to updates and overall support as well. In fact, the last time World War Z got updated with new content was this past December. Really not that bad for a game that came out in 2019 that has 1,500 concurrent players with a 30-day average according to Steam charts. These are all very good things, but I still wanted to include this performance bit on the list because if the game has shitty performance, then we can't enjoy it, and what's the point? So those are the things that I believe Space Marine 2 needs in order to be successful at launch. Atmosphere, story, replayability, variety, and technical performance. I'm not saying that these things are an instant recipe for success upon launch, but I think that a high-budget Warhammer 40k game would benefit greatly from having these things in the list that Saber gets right. I'm also preconditioned to expect a game to fall flat on its face when it hits shelves, and that's a shame, but that's just the era of gaming that we live in right now. When I make these lists, the items on the list are tailor-made for the specific game in question. Considering the size and scope of Space Marine 2, I feel the atmosphere of the game would lend itself well to making a 40k game feel like a 40k game. I think the story and lore aspect of it is almost a given when it comes to any Warhammer title overall. I think the replayability is super important to a third-person action shooter. I think variety works very well in a Warhammer title of any flavor, and I think that this game can live and die on its technical performance given the fidelity that they are going for here. That's about all I have to say right now on Space Marine 2. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.